can zoom it all the way
yeah, I
there.
just don't want like too much
What
car.
do you want? More flags or more guys on the camera?
I like the fence because they're all gonna be up there, but like, should we move over to the left a little bit more?
Like that.
I just want too much car. Yeah, that's perfect. Instead of getting like too much car. Thank you.
ready. I just checked in with Armando and Angel. Once we get the all clear from like the net pools, we can bring it down. Then we're clear for the day.
Oh, you mean just across the bridge? I thought you were gonna go to.
Where these guys are.
Yeah. It's not gonna tell you. I'll put it that way. I don't know anything. I don't know.
Ready? We can come down.
You're sending me home? Sure, go ahead and I'm gonna go file the. I mean, keeping the library is probably the best. When is the Cilia getting back? Well, I think it's probably covering the, you know, I mean, Switzerland, the fire was so distant. My colleague in Houston was in Venezuela. He's on holiday. This guy's like, can you go to the border? He's in Colombia now at the border. Everybody got screwed.
You know what?
Dude, my hotel's literally there. Otherwise, I would.
Right? Hey, you can't even shit in the mix. I know, right? You guys been into what? 3 in the morning? Something like that.
Yeah, I've been here watching. Did anybody tell you you're wearing shorts?
Yes.
Okay, just making sure.
Oh, look, just confirm. Yes, I am in shorts.
No, I just take the mic, the wireless. And I'm probably gonna stop by and grab my jacket. And I'm gonna tell the girl that the guy's coming. I'm gonna wait. It's pretty. It's good.
I think so, yeah. Are we going straight, yeah?
Yeah.
Right, I'll see you guys back.
Yeah,
We'll see you
he
at the office.
he said he's gonna make a circle to see what's going on with parking space.
I mean, some people are leaving too, so like there's spots there.
Yeah, she just left. Anyway, I'm gonna grab the tripod and I will come back.
Bread and sauce.
I mean, we went. They brought him to the. Yeah. And they just like, if you're lucky, you might at a quarter game. Like, that's not March. Or you're gonna be in March. Yeah, but it's like that, like an intersection like that. It's like that's like way too big. Just completely like grades. So if you kind of get like on the other side of this building right here, you can probably get like a drive by. I was out here last time, so I'm just making sure like it's my foot's on, that's what shot. I got into it, because I went to like ESPN Sports a little bit. I interned at like magazine Sports Illustrated, which is actually like a magazine. In that hemisphere. Andre, nice to meet you, Andre. Take care. How would you Instagram?
That's why you gotta get it like
You're watching France 24 with our continuing coverage of the situation in Venezuela. And there you can see on your screens the car in which Nicolas Maduro is at the moment. He is about to come out to head toward the courthouse. Well, he will have that hearing later today. Nicolas Maduro, of course, the former president of Venezuela, who over the weekend was captured in a dramatic fashion after the United States attacked Caracas. Today in that hearing, Nicolas Maduro is going to be facing charges of, among other things, narco-trafficking, drug trafficking. So all of that will be happening throughout the day. That hearing is scheduled to take place at about 12 noon local time, which is 6 p.m. here in Paris. We'll be bringing you all of the latest on that. And there you can see on your screens Nicolas Maduro walking, accompanied by those police officers, heading into that courthouse, which is in the lower part of Manhattan, not far from the jail in Brooklyn where Nicolas Maduro was being held. In the meantime, of course, his vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, is the person who is now currently the interim leader of Venezuela. She initially was very against what had happened to Nicolas Maduro, against the U.S. intervention, but over the weekend has seemed to come around. It looks like now, like Nicolas Maduro is heading into that helicopter. Indeed, it will probably be this helicopter that will take him finally to that courthouse. You can see that chopper there, and we'll keep an eye on all of those images as I bring in France 24's Brian Quinn, because the situation in Venezuela is also having a lot of effect on the business world as well. Brian, tell us a bit more about how important this idea of exploiting Venezuela's oil reserves has been in what's been happening in Venezuela over the weekend, and with this capture of Nicolas Maduro and his wife over the weekend.
Well, Jeannie, oil is a crucial sector for Venezuela, and it has the potential to be among the world's largest. Indeed, Venezuela known to have the largest reserves of underground crude oil deposits, estimated at over 300 billion barrels. That puts it ahead of Middle Eastern giants like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and the UAE. In the 1990s, Venezuela was a production powerhouse. It hit a peak of around 3.5 billion barrels of oil per day. Underinvestment in infrastructure and chronic mismanagement, though, under the Chavez and Maduro governments have sent those figures tumbling. In 2013, the country was still pumping more than 2.5 million barrels per day. By 2018, that had fallen to less than 1.5 million. The imposition of new U.S. sanctions and the COVID pandemic saw production hit a low of just over 500,000, still hovering at less than 1 million barrels per day as of last year. Donald Trump says the U.S. is going to need total access to overhaul Venezuela's beleaguered oil industry. He's talking about having U.S. companies ready to go, coming in with investment to take over the country's oil industry.
So when Donald Trump says U.S. oil firms are going to go in and rebuild, I mean, what are we talking about? What would that require?
A lot of money, Jeannie. Much of Venezuela's oil infrastructure has basically been left to rust. Drilling platforms, pipelines, and refineries pillaged for scrap and spare parts to be sold on the black market. Analysts estimate that getting the industry back into shape will be a $100 billion project, requiring roughly $10 billion per year over the next decade. Among the U.S. firms that are best positioned for a role are Chevron, ExxonMobil, and ConocoPhillips. Now, Exxon and Conoco both left Venezuela in the mid-2000s when their operations were nationalized by Nicolas Maduro's predecessor, Hugo Chavez. Chevron, though, has continued to operate there via its partnership with the Venezuelan state oil giant PDVSA. PDVSA accounts for roughly half the country's production, with Chevron making up around 25%. Chevron, of course, has special licenses from the U.S. to allow it to circumvent American sanctions. That policy aimed at keeping some American leverage on Caracas while those sanctions were still in place. Now, while Venezuela's oil reserves could make it a bonanza for U.S. firms, the sheer cost, as we discussed, $100 billion over 10 years, and the risk of further instability in case this doesn't work out for Venezuela, mean that it is far from a safe bet for those companies.
Indeed. All right, Brian, thanks so much for that. Brian Quinn there with your business update. Of course, a lot of focus in the business world, or the rest of the world, on Nicolas Maduro and his fate. So here you can see the helicopter that Nicolas Maduro entered just moments ago. He had spent the night in a prison in Brooklyn after that impressive seizure, an attack, the U.S. moving into Caracas over the weekend in Venezuela, seizing Nicolas Maduro and his wife, bringing them to the U.S., They've been staying in a prison in Brooklyn. Just moments ago, we saw Nicolas Maduro getting into a car. That car was driven to this airfield you can see now, where we see this helicopter, which we can only assume is going to be moving him closer to the courthouse, where he will appear for a hearing later. We'll be keeping a close eye on this for you as it progresses here on France 24. Do stay with us. The images you see on your screen there are a helicopter that is carrying the ousted Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, who is due in a New York court later this Monday. He will be facing drug charges. In the meantime, the UN, also located in New York, will be scrutinizing the legality of that move from U.S. President Donald Trump, that extraordinary operation to move in and capture Nicolas Maduro along with his wife over the weekend. This was the biggest U.S. intervention in Latin America since the 1989 invasion of Panama. Over the weekend, we saw special forces swoop into Caracas on helicopters. They smashed through Maduro's security cordon and kidnapped him, some might say, at the door of a safe room. Senior officials from his government, 13 years in power, do remain in charge. Those include his vice president, Rodriguez. The South American oil nation, of course, Venezuela, has 30 million people and, above all, a lot of oil, which is particularly interesting to the U.S. President, Donald Trump. Donald Trump, who, of course, has denounced Maduro as a dictator, as a drug kingpin, someone who flooded the U.S. with cocaine, really making no bones about wanting to share in the oil riches in Venezuela. So a lot of this will be developing today. Again, there you can see the helicopter that is crossing now Manhattan as it heads toward the courtroom where Nicolas Maduro will appear before a judge at some point during the day. Nicolas Maduro, again, who spent the night at a jail in Brooklyn. I'm here on the set with France 24's Brian Quinn, our business editor. And Brian, just explain to us a bit more, if you will, about how important this oil is in the world economy, the global economy, and what it would mean to the U.S. and particularly to Donald Trump.
Well, it could be important. Eventually, Venezuela has around 17% of the world's known oil reserves. At the moment, it is not especially important. That's due to the decades of mismanagement and decay in its oil industry that we were talking about earlier. Right now, it accounts for just around 1% of the world's oil markets. So really what we've been seeing on oil markets is a fair bit of nonchalance. Oil is basically treading water, oil futures today. It's most important, perhaps, for the moment, to China. China is the top customer of Venezuela's oil. It takes around 2/3 of Venezuela's exports. That, though, Venezuela has a very particular type of oil that's very thick, sludgy. China uses it for roadworks and industrial fuel. It's not as useful or much more difficult to process into typical vehicular fuels that you would see in the West, like refined gasoline or even diesel. It's more of a, I mean, it can be made into that, obviously, and there are refineries that are specialized in that, not just in China, but along the Gulf Coast of the U.S. But as we said, these years of mismanagement have really slowed Venezuela's production to a trickle. And now, in fact, with the U.S., what they're calling the quarantine on Venezuelan oil, essentially a naval blockade of tankers, we're seeing Venezuela's oil storage facilities fill up to beyond their capacity, where even still the oil production facilities that are still working are not going to have anywhere to put that oil because they're not going to be able to send it. So China itself is not happy about this, to say the least. They're not reacting forcefully, but they are expressing clear disapproval of it. However, it's not going to make a huge difference to China. China has a buffer of some 82 million barrels of oil from sanctioned countries like Venezuela, Iran, Russia, even sitting in tankers at sea, just waiting to be used. So they have that buffer. They have other sources of oil. They get the Venezuelan oil at a steep discount. They like that. But the loss of it for the immediate future is not going to make a huge difference for them. What really remains to be seen is how the Trump administration plans to go in and overhaul the Venezuelan oil industry. I mean, there are companies that are operating there now currently. The U.S. company Chevron, we see Maduro getting out of the helicopter there. The oil company American Chevron operates in Venezuela under special licenses that allow it to get around U.S. sanctions. And that's in part just so that the U.S. can have an American company operating on the ground there, keeping an eye on how exports are going, and maintain some leverage over Caracas. Obviously, that leverage has now been used and taken up a notch, you would say, to the extreme with this capture of Maduro, seeing him perp walked across the roof of a Manhattan courthouse.
We can only assume it is the Manhattan courthouse. Earlier, as the helicopter was flying from Brooklyn to the southern tip of Manhattan, we could see the sun starting to rise there. Now, apparently, Maduro isn't due to appear in court for at least 4.5 hours. So we'll see if that indeed gets moved up or if the information is changing. As you can imagine, this is a very fluid situation. Nicolas Maduro seeming to have some trouble walking there. We've seen that since he's done a series of perp walks, as you say, Brian, since he was first taken over the weekend in that very dramatic attack on Caracas. Nicolas Maduro going to appear before that New York court today. He's going to be facing drug charges. Now, of course, there are a lot of questions about the legality of all of this. The UN wanting to scrutinize the legality of Donald Trump's extraordinary operation to move in and capture him. But as the specialist in international law was telling us earlier when we were speaking to her, the difficulty with that is if the UN were to put any kind of sanctions on the U.S., those sanctions would basically be void because the U.S., of course, has a veto as a member of the UN Security Council. And so there is no way that, of course, the U.S. would sanction itself. So not a lot of room for maneuvering there from the international community in that regard at this point. But this was indeed the biggest U.S. intervention in Latin America since the 1989 invasion of Panama. We saw those special forces helicopters swoop into Caracas over the weekend. They smashed through Maduro's security cordon. They nabbed him right at the door of a safe room. I mean, it's really like something out of a movie. We now have his vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, who is in charge. She, of course, initially was very anti-U.S., even saying early over the weekend that it was she was going against the U.S., but then seemed to change her tune as the days went on. And there were a lot of mixed messages we've seen over the past 48 hours as well, between Donald Trump saying things like, we're in charge of Venezuela now, and then the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, backpedaling on all of the Sunday talk shows, trying to say that he was not convinced that was exactly what was happening. So there is still a lot of confusion on what's actually going to be happening in Venezuela, what it means. Would U.S. troops eventually go in? But as you can imagine, Venezuela's acting president is now inviting the U.S. government to collaborate on what she has called an agenda of cooperation. Our Delano de Souza's been taking a closer look at this. He reports now on the uncertainty that's gripping the country.
After a tumultuous weekend, an eerie calm grips the streets of Caracas. Residents attempt to go about their daily lives while a sense of uncertainty lingers in the air. With power outages still frequent, makeshift phone charging stations have popped up in certain neighborhoods, an opportunity for people to get the latest on what's unfolding.
Look at the situation we're living in. There are shortages in hospitals and pharmacies for everything. There's anxiety and desperation, and we don't know what will happen.
We're all living with this uncertainty, trying to see what will happen, what the directives will be, so we can continue with life.
On Sunday, long queues formed outside supermarkets as fears mount of dwindling supplies. But it's a reality Venezuelans acknowledge they've been grappling with for years.
It's basically instinct. Obviously, we've had 6 years of living in shortages and practically queuing 24 hours, a full day, once a week. You come here to buy whatever's needed.
We have to be proactive so that nothing takes us by surprise, because I, at least, am almost 70 years old, a person with a condition, a disability, and here I am pushing forward.
Venezuela was once considered one of the most prosperous states in Latin America, but economic mismanagement over the past 2 decades, coupled with the weight of U.S. sanctions, have resulted in financial collapse. As Venezuelans wait to see where the dust settles, there is hope for better days ahead.
You're watching France 24 with our continuing coverage of Nicolas Maduro, the ousted Venezuelan leader who is due to appear in a court in New York this Monday. There you can see the car that is taking Nicolas Maduro to that courtroom, we can only assume. He is due to be in court at about 6 p.m. French time. That's around 12 noon in New York City after having spent the night in a jail in Brooklyn. I'm joined on the set now by France 24's Philip Tourle, who's been keeping a close eye on all of this for us as well. Philip, just remind everyone a bit about what exactly happened over the weekend and how Nicolas Maduro came to be seized so dramatically by U.S. forces.
We were all taken aback by the fact that this was totally unannounced. It was not expected. We were sort of thinking Donald Trump might launch more attacks against Venezuela. He'd launched attacks against boats. He killed over 100 so-called drug traffickers that he's accused of bringing cocaine to the United States, and been threatening quite a long time down the line that he was going to launch at some point some kind of attack against Venezuela. But the actual capture of Nicolas Maduro and his wife and their transfer to this prison in Brooklyn, I think, took everybody aback by the fact that it happened so quickly. Not even Congress was consulted about this in the United States. So there was a lot of action that nobody really expected. So there's a lot, and also you can tell when you look at these images of this armored vehicle carrying the former Venezuelan president and his wife to the courthouse where they're due to appear in about 3 hours from now. All the symbolism involved, the fact that we're being shown this image of him being taken through the streets of New York to this courthouse, the fact that this is the power of the United States, the power of Donald Trump. Yes, we can go in there, we can arrest these rogue leaders. So just be careful in case you are considered a rogue leader by Donald Trump. This could happen to you as well, because obviously these images are being shown all the way around the world on many international and national television stations right now. So it's sort of like a warning towards all of those who might be in the spotlight of Donald Trump, notably in Cuba, for example, also in Mexico. They've all come under accusations of not being able to draw the line, and also moreover in Colombia, where Donald Trump has accused the president of being someone who is sick. So what we're seeing here is the next step in what's happening to Nicolas Maduro. He's going to appear before a judge, as I was saying, in about 3.5 hours from now, where he's going to be charged with narco traffic and drug pushing in the United States. We'll have to see how that plays out and what exactly the charges are against him. But as I said, a very symbolic view this afternoon of all this taking place in the streets of New York, and really a sort of warning, look, the United States is here. You better be careful, because we'll be coming after you next.
Right. And of course, this all comes as the UN Security Council is also meeting a little bit later today to actually debate the legality of Trump's raid. And there really was no legal basis at all for the U.S. to go in like that.
Well, if you look at international law, there's no body that oversees international law that can intervene to say, well, you broke the law. But it's true that there was no consulting of the United Nations as to whether or not the US should go in and do this. There is a way that the US can go in to seize someone if they are under direct threat of attack. That didn't appear to be the case with Venezuela. There was no, in the United States itself, there was no agreement in Congress, as I was saying, for Donald Trump to go in and to seize Nicolas Maduro. So it's pretty thin on the ground for the legal basis for doing this. But there again, this is something the United States has already done in the past with Mikel Noriega in 1989 in Panama, where they went in and seized him against all international law. And I think what Donald Trump is doing this time around is pretty much basing what he's doing here on what happened in 1989 for Mikel Noriega, the former dictator of Panama, who was then incarcerated in the United States. So we're seeing a repetition of that, but this has left many nations short of breath in how to react to this. There have been very strong reactions from many left-wing organizations and governments in Latin America, but here in Europe, the response from many leaders, including Emmanuel Macron, including Keir Starmer, the leader of the British Prime Minister, have been criticized for being pretty lackluster and not tapping on the table saying the United States has broken international law, more or less welcoming the fall of Nicolas Maduro and saying, yes, it's a good thing that he's gone, but not criticizing the US action and the US decision not to uphold international law.
Indeed. And while all of this is happening, we have Donald Trump also announcing his intention to, quote, run Venezuela. Meanwhile, you have the Venezuelan vice president, who's now the interim leader, Delcy Rodriguez, who used her inaugural address to say never again will we be a colony, speaking of Venezuela. Of course, just about 24 hours after those comments, Rodriguez seemed to change her tune, saying that she would indeed be ready to try and work with the United States. Our Charlie Hughes takes a closer look at what Venezuela's future might hold.
Crowds of demonstrators took to the streets of the Venezuelan capital a day after the US bombed the country and seized its leader Nicolas Maduro and his wife. Some in the capital are anxious about what lies ahead.
Actually, I'm anxious because I don't know what's going to happen. I try to stay calm because I have a family, I have small children.
These pictures show the Supreme Court delivering their ruling that Delcy Rodriguez should take over as president, a ruling that has been endorsed by Venezuela's defense minister, who has urged the country's population to resume to their normal activities.
The Bolivarian government will guarantee the governability of the country, and our institution will continue to use all its available capabilities for military defense, the maintenance of internal order, and the preservation of peace.
Trump has warned Rodriguez she will pay a bigger price than Maduro if, quote, she doesn't do what's right. Describing the idea of elections in Venezuela as premature at this stage, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has suggested the US won't govern Venezuela, but will push for change through an existing oil blockade.
If they don't make the right decisions, the United States will retain multiple levers of leverage to ensure that our interests are protected. And that includes the oil quarantine that's in place.
Trump has made no secret of his plans to send in US oil companies to tap the country's vast reserves, even if his administration maintains that this is a transitional phase towards a more democratic regime. The US president immediately precluded the possibility of working with Venezuelan opposition leader and recent Nobel laureate Maria Corina Machado on the grounds that she was not sufficiently respected or supported in the country.
This is France 24, and throughout the day, we will be covering that first appearance of the ousted Venezuelan leader, Nicolas Maduro, at a court in New York City. We saw him moments ago being transferred from the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, where he had been held for the past 2 nights, along with his wife, after they were seized so dramatically over the weekend in that special forces attack on Caracas. So you can see those images we saw earlier of Nicolas Maduro in the tan jumpsuit coming out of the helicopter, handcuffed, seeming to have some difficulty walking. Later, we saw him go into an armored vehicle, and that armored vehicle seemed to pull backwards into what we can only assume is the courthouse, where he will appear later. He's facing drugs and weapons charges, also charges of narco-terrorism. Nicolas Maduro, there, the ousted leader of Venezuela, now been replaced by his vice president, Delcy Rodriguez. And I'm joined on the set by our Philip Turl, who's watching all of this with me as well. And Philip, I think the one thing that's becoming clearer and clearer as we've moved on from this surprise attack, as you were saying earlier a few days ago, is just how important Venezuela's oil resources are in all of this.
Yeah, well, I mean, just to follow up on the images we're seeing here, I mean, this is quite unbelievable to see Nicolas Maduro. Donald Trump loves television. He based his whole life on good TV. Remember that remark he made after the bust up with Volodymyr Zelensky in the White House back in February last year, saying this makes great TV. Well, there's nothing better for Donald Trump than to show this, to say, look, we've got him. Here he is. We're walking him the walk of shame, if you like, towards the courthouse for Nicolas Maduro. Now, going back to the subject that you were mentioning, oil, of course, there are many in the US saying that what Donald Trump is doing is incredibly unclear, because this was originally based on two factors: the idea to launch these attacks against boats off the coast of Venezuela. The first one was to stop drug trafficking, drug cartels from reportedly sending in vast amounts of cocaine to the United States via Venezuela. But when you examine the facts, most of that cocaine doesn't come from Venezuela, which is a very small country when it comes to the drug trade. It's more from Colombia. And most of the cocaine coming out of Venezuela is actually on its way to Europe and not to the United States. That's the first point. The second point is that Donald Trump has said right from the very start, Venezuela is sending in vast amounts of migrants. It's emptying out its jails with criminals and those who are mentally ill, and they're being told to go to the United States. There's been no proof of this right the way down the line. And many are saying, well, look, what Donald Trump wants to do is to put his hands on the oil supply in Venezuela, which has the world's biggest supply of oil. Donald Trump's made no secret of the fact that he likes mineral resources. That's what he's signed a deal with in Ukraine. That's what he's pretty much after in Greenland. And now he's putting his hands on the oil resources in Venezuela. What Donald Trump's basically done here is he's put his hands on the biggest service station in the world. That is the one which is built in Venezuela in the form of the oil that is underground in Venezuela. He says we're going to be sending in US firms to deal with the oil in Venezuela. Of course, that will be given back to the people of Venezuela, but there's no secret in the fact that Donald Trump wants his hands on that oil. He also wants to prevent Venezuela from supporting Cuba because he'd like to bring down Cuba. That's been a thorn in the side of many US leaders for decades. He also wants to stop China from its influence in the region because it also takes on board vast amounts of that oil from Venezuela. So all of this is a project by Donald Trump to put his hands on that oil supply in Venezuela to prevent some of his adversaries from doing the same thing. There is a very important question that we haven't got the answer to right now, Jeannie, and that is, what is the next step for Donald Trump? Will he send troops on the ground, or will he continue to negotiate with the interim vice president of Venezuela, who will then become president, Delcy Rodriguez, who was vice president to Nicolas Maduro? Is that going to be enough for Delcy Rodriguez to go in the way that Donald Trump wants, to become US friendly, Donald Trump friendly, when she was a staunch adversary of Donald Trump and a supporter of Nicolas Maduro? If that doesn't work out, then Donald Trump will be face to face with what could be a void that could be very quickly filled either by the Chinese or by the Russians. And that would mean that he would have to send in US forces on the ground to stabilize the situation in Venezuela. We don't really know for the moment how that is going to play out. And there's not been much information coming out from the White House.
All right. We'll be keeping a close eye on all of this throughout the day. Philip Troll, thank you so much for your insight there. We'll be checking back in with you as well throughout the day as we head toward that hearing of the ousted Venezuelan leader, Nicolas Maduro, which should be happening a few hours from now in New York City. In the meantime,
this is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. As we talk more about the U.S. attack on Venezuela and the abduction of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, they are now, as we broadcast, being brought into the federal courthouse in New York, brought by helicopter from Brooklyn, where they have been placed in the Metropolitan Detention Center. We want to go back to President Trump speaking about Venezuela's oil on Saturday, hours after the U.S. attack.
In addition, Venezuela unilaterally seized and sold American oil, American assets, and American platforms, costing us billions and billions of dollars. They did this a while ago, but we never had a president that did anything about it. They took all of our property. It was our property. We built it. And we never had a president that decided to do anything about it. Instead, they fought wars that were 10,000 miles away. We built Venezuela oil industry with American talent, drive, and skill. And the socialist regime stole it from us during those previous administrations, and they stole it through force. This constituted one of the largest thefts of American property in the history of our country. Considered the largest theft of property in the history of our country. Massive oil infrastructure was taken like we were babies, and we didn't do anything about it. I would have done something about it.
That's President Trump talking about the theft of Venezuelan oil, talking about it as our oil. We're joined by two guests in our New York studio, Alejandro Velasco, associate professor at New York University, where he's historian of modern Latin America, former executive editor of NACLA Report on the Americas, author of the book Barrio Rising, Urban Popular Politics and the Making of Modern Venezuela. He was born and raised in Venezuela. And Miguel Tinker Salas is with us, emeritus professor of history at Pomona College in Claremont, California, author of The Enduring Legacy, Oil, Culture and Society in Venezuela, and the book Venezuela, What Everyone Needs to Know. Welcome back, both of you, to Democracy Now! Professor Miguel Tinker Salas, oil is what you've been covering in Venezuela for decades. Talk about Trump's comments that it's Venezuela's oil that will fund the U.S. running Venezuela.
Well, we heard this with Bush in the Iraq invasion, that the oil from Iraq was going to finance the intervention and the long-term rebuilding. The reality is that failed in Iraq, and it will fail in Venezuela. Venezuela's oil industry has taken a hit in the last 15 years. It is a semblance of what it used to be. And the reality is I cannot imagine any American oil company going into Venezuela, spending billions of dollars to build up an infrastructure without American boots on the ground or without very clear guarantees. And even if they did, the process would take close to a decade. So Trump is talking the same way he always does. It is an exaggeration. It is an outright lie. And I believe it to be simply another pretext, another excuse to try to convince the American public that what he did had any value.
And Miguel Tinker Salas, I wanted to ask you again something that we discussed on Saturday in our special report on the Venezuela invasion. This whole notion of Trump, the lie that he keeps foisting on the American public, that it was the socialist government of Venezuela that took this oil, when in reality the nationalization of Venezuela's oil industry occurred long before anyone had heard of Hugo Chavez and the Bolivarian Revolution. Could you talk about that history as well?
Sure. Venezuelans were always keen on gaining control over its own oil industry. Without a doubt, American and Europeans were present at the beginning of the oil industry, but the actual work was done by Venezuelans. The actual establishment of the industry was done by Venezuelans. And there was always an aspiration that oil industry would belong to the country and the country could benefit from that more than simply providing concessions to foreign oil companies. So the nationalization happened in 1975. It was a fully compensated nationalization taking effect on January 1st, 1976, and it was done under the government of Carlos Andrés Pérez, a social democratic government, not Hugo Chavez. Chavez did close the door to openings that were there for American foreign companies in Article 5 of the reform. And in 2007, there was a clash with ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips over oil deposits in the Orinoco Basin. And Exxon demanded $16 billion. A court decided that they only owed $1.6 billion. So you can see from the very beginning that the process of nationalization had been compensated and negotiated. So there was no taking of quote unquote American property or American oil. It was Venezuelan oil. It belonged to Venezuela, and it was the purview of the Venezuelan government to decide who or what operated those oil fields.
And Miguel, I also wanted to ask you about other resources that have not been mentioned, but that clearly American capitalists are salivating over the prospects of getting access to. One is coltan, a rare metal that is in most laptop computers and phones, and has uses for the military, as well as diamonds and gold. You talk about the immense resources that Venezuela has in these other areas.
Oil is only on the surface. The reality is, as you point out, Venezuela is rich in gold. It's rich in rare earths, rare minerals. It is rich in gas, one of the largest deposits of gas in the world. It is rich in lithium. It has potential for tremendous lithium. It has coal. It has other minerals as well. So that the positioning of the U.S. as a investor in Venezuela, or as a corporate interest in Venezuela, is massive. It involves not only the country's strategic position and is an interface between the Caribbean and South America, but it involves the possession of tremendous mineral deposits and oil deposits. It reminds me of what the American general in charge of the Caribbean during World War II said: if of all the countries of Latin America, I only want one ally, and that is Venezuela, because they're beautifully rich in oil and minerals. That has been the position of the U.S. government since 1940 and to the present.
I'd also like to bring in a professor, NYU professor Alejandro Velasco, into the conversation. Professor Velasco, on Saturday evening, you posted on social media that it seemed as if, quote, Maduro was given up by the remaining government apparatus in a back-channel deal. Do you still think that? And what would that mean? And do you believe that Delcy Rodriguez, who is now will be now sworn in as interim president, was herself complicit in this operation?
Obviously, it's somewhat speculative, but clues point in some kind of direction that suggests that might be the case. One of the things that we do know is that months leading up to, of course, the abduction of Nicolás Maduro and people like Delcy Rodriguez, Jorge Rodriguez, and others.
Explain Jorge Rodriguez, her brother?
Yeah, Jorge Rodriguez is Delcy's brother. Both of them.
He's head of the National Assembly.
He is head of the National Assembly, but has held many posts under Chavez's government and then under Maduro's government for years. Both of them have a long story tradition of leftist politics in Latin America. In Venezuela in particular. Their father was a Marxist guerrilla who was assassinated under the government in the 1970s, and were closely allied with the United States. And they've really cemented a position in government as being right-hand people to Maduro, for sure, but Chavez before him. But what we had seen in the months leading up to the abduction was that Maduro and these inner circle members had been negotiating with the Trump administration things like oil deals, things like other kinds of investment from the United States. But the missing piece there seemed to be whether Maduro would remain in power. And given how quickly the operation unfolded on Saturday, and how quickly it seems that Delcy Rodriguez has been able to consolidate power over the intervening 48 hours, you have to assume that there was some kind of collusion, or at least some kind of conversation happening between the parties beforehand. Maduro in exchange for remaining in power, Maduro in exchange for stability, Maduro in exchange for some kind of open dealing with the United States. Now, of course, the challenge for Delcy and others is, can they straddle this line between doing in some ways Trump's bidding, and then at the same time maintaining, as Adela Chavez was saying earlier, a position of sovereignty and mutual respect of bilateral relations between Venezuela and the United States. I don't know if they'll be able to do it.
And